Past month, we've been talking about trust. We began with Brene Brown's analogy of the marble jar, and we began to unpack what the anatomy of trust is. We covered the first three letters of that, which were boundaries, reliability, and accountability. So today we come to the letter V on braving, which stands for vault. For me, this is an interesting metaphor for confidentiality because vaults are supposed to keep what's inside safe. It's usually something precious. Why am I beginning to sound like the one of the hobbits from Lord of the Rings, right? Or Gollum even, precious. Something precious and valuable. In the context of relationships, that may be something that someone is struggling with, like a divorce or eating disorder, or perhaps even substance abuse. To share that precious thing that you're holding inside with another person takes a great deal of courage and vulnerability. And it's interesting that vaults only have one door that goes in and out. And isn't it interesting that only one person gets to control that door, and that person is the one who knows the code for the vault, because it is that person who owns their own story. Now, I hope we realize that that person is not obligated to share that code with anyone else. And to do so would be a great honor and requires a significant amount of trust and confidence in another person, which is why it's called holding confidentiality. Now, I'm not saying this is the case with First U, but in many congregations out there, people's struggles can sometimes turn into rumors. That's why there's this whole concept or idea of what's now known as church gossip, right? And why that's a thing. And sometimes these gossips and rumors are spread to try to hotwire relationships with other congregants. For example, a person will say, did you know that Dominique is having an affair with Sandra, who has been struggling with depression recently? Now, a tempting reaction from the person receiving this information might be, oh my gosh, really? Tell me more. But another reaction could be, if that person couldn't be trusted to keep Dominique's confidence, why should I trust that person with my story? I would certainly think twice before I allow myself to be vulnerable in front of that person moving forward. Now, remember Reverend Nell Newton's quote that I shared with you a couple of weeks ago, who said that privacy is held to protect dignity, confidence is held to protect the vulnerable, and secrets are held to protect the powerful. Now, again, I feel like what happened in that instance was that Dominique was vulnerable enough to share her story with person A and ask them to keep confidentiality. But clearly, person A could not be trusted with the combination key to the vault. Us ministers, like therapists, have been given the sacred responsibility of holding anything said during a pastoral care session in the strictest of confidence. And that's part of what helps engender trust in us and in our role. Sharing something during joys and sorrows is also an act of vulnerability and trust to the rest of the congregation. But in this instance, it's a little bit more public than on a one-on-one setting. Joys and Sorrows is our community's way of practicing community care within a safe environment. This is also part of what makes our journey groups so trustworthy, in that there's always a covenant that is shared amongst this group that is read at the beginning of each gathering to make sure that the people within that group create a safe environment where confidentiality is held, and that there's a sense that the vault, which is the container, allows us to actually be vulnerable with one another. And that is why I think that our journey groups are the ones who have been, and the ones who have been meeting for the longest time, have the most marbles built over that period of time. So that's the thing with Volt. I'm going to move on because we have 3 other letters to cover. And I stands for integrity. Here's Brené's definition of that. She breaks it down into 3 parts. 1, integrity means choosing courage over comfort. And it's choosing what's right over what's fun, fast, or easy. And it's practicing your values, not just professing your values. I found over the years in ministry that when conflict arises or an important issue needs to be addressed, it's often easier to simply brush it aside or let someone else deal with it rather than approaching the person directly and or holding someone accountable for their actions, or expressing our true feelings about the situation at hand. Now, sometimes we do this under the guise of we just want to be polite or nice, or we don't really want to rock the boat. But you know what? Being kind and being nice are not the same thing. You could say something that may be difficult to hear and might even come across as being quote unquote impolite. But if your intent is to show kindness and that's your motivation for expressing it, and if you say it in such a way that would be in alignment with your values, this will actually further a trusting relationship rather than withholding your feelings, or worse yet, sweeping the issue under the rug, because that will just fester and turn into resentment over time. I think that's why a lot of people don't trust politicians, because they often either do things just to appease their constituents, or they get so caught up and worried about the next election cycle that it becomes more about political expediency rather than doing what's morally right and what would be beneficial for society in the long run. Again, integrity is doing the right thing, even if it's not fast, fun, or easy. Integrity is the hallmark of a truly trustworthy leader. And then we get to the letter N, which stands for non-judgment. This for me is probably the most difficult letter out of all of them, because as a clergy person, as someone who is supposed to have a strong moral compass, I'm asked to make decisions and judgment calls day in and day out. So it's a bit tough for me to refrain from judgment. In a polarized world, we are all forced to put everyone into camps: us versus them, right versus wrong, good versus bad. And you know what? I'm not going to argue that it's all relative either, because I do think that there are certain things that are morally reprehensible, and we do need to speak out when those occurrences happen. But I think the kind of non-judgment that Brené talks about has to do with placing judgments on whether or not we ask for help, for example. Again, over the years, I've noticed that in many UU congregations I've served, There's a sense of pride that we're always supposed to be competent, well put together, and doggone it, have everything under our control, right? But which, in a way really makes it difficult for us to then ask for help. And it makes it difficult for pastoral care opportunities to arise because we don't want to be judged as being weak or needy. Or perhaps that's how we judge ourselves, which is then what we project onto others. So it creates this endless loop here of not asking for help when we need it. That's what I love about the song in our Teal hymnal that we're going to sing in a few minutes here. And many of us are probably familiar with it because it was sung by, or it was crafted by Bill Withers, right, a long time ago. And it goes, sometime in our lives, we all have pain, we all have sorrow. And indeed, sickness and suffering does not define us. And hopefully that's not all we have to deal with 24/7. But when those times do come about, can we trust someone enough to ask for help? And can we also trust that when we do, they won't judge us when we ask for help? Because at some point, the situation could turn around easily. And it's going to be one of those moments when we're the ones in need of a shoulder to cry on, or we're the ones that are going to be in need for someone to lean on. So why don't we just put those judgments aside and try to focus on the caring aspect instead? And why don't we just, rather than judge ourselves or each other, focus on the actual caring bit? For me, that's what will help build trust with one another. So let's hold our opinions lightly and not rush into conclusions or to be married to our own ideas in such a way that we cling on to them so tightly. And speaking of which, my colleague, who shall remain nameless, once said that we use are an opinion-full faith. This is how things should be, we often hear, or how the chair should be arranged, or which hymns to pick, or which words to use, and so on and so forth. And I bet she probably also wanted to add, we're full of criticisms, which leads me to the last letter, which is G for generosity. I know our minds immediately go towards dollar signs when we think of that word generosity, but did you know that there's more to generosity than money? Say what? What are you talking about, Rev J? Well, back in the 1970s, Dr. Gottman and Robert Levinson did a scientific experiment of couples who are in a relationship together. And they found that for every negative interaction one person of the couple or the couple has had, you need to actually find 5 other positive interactions to balance it out. This is called the magic relationship ratio. So believe it or not, it's not 1 for 1, meaning for one negative interaction or one negative criticism, you get one positive interaction or one kind word out of your partner. Because when that one-on-one ratio happens, it ends up with this thing we call a divorce, right? So that means that if you make one criticism, you need to have already at least 5 other compliments in the bank. It's the same concept as Brene Brown's marble jar. The marble jar can't be empty because otherwise you'd be dealing with a deficit account here. And so that's what generosity means. It means that we're generous with our assumptions of one another, that we're generous with our words and our compliments to one another. And we're generous with how we spend time with one another. So if any of you are keeping track, you'll also recognize that this is also in alignment with Gary Chapman's 5 love languages, right? And gift giving is also another one. And yeah, perhaps cold, hard cash doesn't hurt either. But I'll leave that discussion to Chris and the rest of the board during our AGM later on today. But needless to say, we used to have a tagline with my colleagues at the UUA when we were working with congregations. We said, we are going to do everything with this idea in mind of generosity in all things. So if that were, what would happen if that were to be our mantra here at First U as well, that we are going to practice generosity in all things? Now, I know what you're thinking, because this is exactly what I'm thinking about as well at this point. You're saying, oh my gosh, Roger, this is all so difficult. How could we possibly go through each and every single one of these letters and practice it? Well, that's why Brene Brown, I think, says that it takes courage to go through this whole process of building trust with one another. And I think that's why this acronym is BRAVING, which stands for braving, right? That boundaries, reliability, accountability, vault, integrity, non-judgment, and generosity all require us to muster up enough courage to do so. And notice that the acronym is not CHEAP or EASY, right? It's not those letters of building trust, because braving trust is a spiritual practice, because all of us at some point are not going to do it right or get it right the first time or even the second or third time. That's why we have a covenant with one another, that whenever we do screw up, we try to forgive ourselves and each other and begin again in love. But I hope this helps us to be able to at least put some concrete language whenever those moments come of trust has been violated. And I hope it allows us to be able to name the impact of what happened so that we can approach someone else and come back again in love. Because, when you said that you were going to bring those banners, this is an example of, when trust was violated, right? Remember that banner story and the banners and the signs? Remember when you said you were going to do that, but didn't? And instead, the Chihuahua got more attention than the congregation during the Pride Parade? Remember that opportunity? Well, I need to be able to rely on you. So what needs to happen next time so that this situation and this scenario could play out differently? And after you ask that question, actually pause and take time to listen and allow that uncomfortable or awkward silence to actually fill the room. Don't rush into then rushing by saying what else you need from that person, but actually take the time to listen. And imagine how transformative that moment can be when you do that truth-telling moment, when you allow yourself to be vulnerable enough to that person. Because what you're really saying is that this relationship is worthwhile for us to be able to salvage it. That I want to build a trusting relationship with you in the future. So how could we use this braving acronym to actually further our relationship with one another and again with ourselves? So moving forward, I encourage all of us to learn to trust ourselves, to trust each other, and trust in the benevolence of the universe. Because when we know better, I know we can do better. I have faith in each and every single one of you on my Zoom screen right now, and I trust that you will faithfully engage in this process of braving trust. Can I get an amen? Let us now take a few deep breaths and reflect. on this whole notion of trust that we've been talking about this month and how to cultivate trust.